He's doing like a half queen wave or what?
As you probably heard, I'm going to be talking about failure and weakness and suffering. Clearly an emotional topic.
For some people, it's a song.
So to help me get into the vibe of the thing, I woke up with an absolutely killer headache at 5 this morning, so that I sit before you in pain and half tired, just to feel more weak, as I speak with you. And then I forgot to shave too, so which is one of my failures in life, that I do forget to shave from time to time. It's because sometimes I shave with the blade and sometimes I use the electric. I changed that. But it's not as bad as one time. There was one time when I was still living out of town that I drove into town and headed into my counseling office and realized I'd only shaved one half of my face.
It's a new trend.
So that's like, I had to somewhat sheepishly pop into Pete's place and say, "Do you mind if I just borrow a razor and shave half my face?" Anyway, so I will be talking about failure and weakness and suffering, and I'm going to be starting off by just kind of laying side by side 3 different things on the topic. And the first is going to be a song by Ray and Sarah.
So the song is actually from former students of James. I guess he's somewhat faculty now too. So Joel Mason. If you haven't met him yet, you will someday soon.
Sunday. The song is called Jesus' Love for the Poor.
Jesus, love.
So already knowing what I was going to speak on when two of them and Holly and Maddie too, I guess, all sang that song Sunday morning, I just thought that was the perfect opening for what I wanted to share today. Now the next piece is going to be a very, very different piece. It's actually going to be a very hard piece of writing, so my apologies. This is the kind of thing that you find disturbing to hear. Well, it is the kind of thing that's disturbing. Probably we should all be the kind of people who find this disturbing to hear. But it's by Elie Wiesel, a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, talking about one particularly difficult moment. One day as we returned from work, we saw 3 gallows. The SS guards seemed more preoccupied, more worried than usual. To hang a child in front of thousands of onlookers was not a small matter. The head of the camp read the verdict. All eyes were on the child. He was pale, almost calm, but he was biting his lips as he stood in the shadow of the gallows. "Where is merciful God? Where is he?" someone behind me was asking. At the signal, the 3 chairs were tipped over. Then came the march past the victims. The 2 men were no longer alive. The child, too light, was still breathing. And so he remained for more than half an hour, lingering between life and death. Behind me, I heard the same man asking, "For God's sake, where is God?" And from within me, I heard a voice answer, "Where is he? This is where, hanging here from this gallows." And that's quoted in a book by Frank Schaeffer, who writes a book called Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God. And set in the context of the only God that makes sense in a world full of suffering is the God who's in the middle of that suffering, the co-suffering God, as he calls him there. And again, very different. The next piece that I'm going to read is from an author named Jeremy Rifkin, writing about empathy and about what he sees as the growth and spread of empathy in the world. This is some things that he says about empathy. Empathy, however, transcends death in a very different way, not by repressing the temporary nature of embodied experience, but by acknowledging it in all of its fragility, and then living life to its fullest. The drive for perfection gives way to the quest for self-realization. Instead of running away from life, one attempts to optimize it. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "Whoever rightly understands and celebrates death at the same time magnifies life." Hegel reminds us that all living creatures have the seed of passing away as their essential being. The hour of their birth is the hour of their death. By accepting death, we affirm life. So we empathize with each other's struggles against death and for life. One acknowledges the whiff of death in another's frailties and vulnerabilities. No one ever empathizes with a perfect being. I want to try that thought on for size for a minute. No one ever empathizes with a perfect being. Supporting and comforting another and coming to her aid is an affirmation and celebration of her living being. The shared bond intensifies one's own sense of aliveness. Does one ever feel more alive than when in an empathetic embrace? And then just a short paragraph further on. Empathetic consciousness would be strangely out of place in either heaven or utopia, where there is no mortal suffering, there is no empathic bond. So what I was meaning to do with those 3 pieces is layer 3 things beside each other, 3 words, 3 thoughts on the idea of failure and suffering. And the first from referring to Jesus, a song inspired by the Beatitudes, by Jesus focusing on the heart of love being centered on the poor and how we all are welcomed into accepting that poverty. The second from a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, reflecting on the only way that God makes sense is if it's God who's in the middle of suffering with us, alongside of us. And then this, I think probably safe to call him an agnostic writer, often a sympathetic critic of Christianity in his writings, but writing about how what empathy is about. Empathy requires suffering, requires failure, because it's only when we acknowledge the fragility of life, the fact that life is lived in the real mixture with death, that we need empathy, that we have empathy and experience it, and therefore are welcomed into our humanity because of those very things. So I found it very interesting thinking about how that sense of compassion and solidarity in the midst of pain and suffering and failure and weakness, that is the heart of what makes us human, and it's the heart of where we experience God, experience God-likeness in ourselves and in other people. And yet, of course, it's something that we tend to want to push away, and we tend to want to not talk about very much when we experience it often, and that kind of thing. When I think the main sort of invitation that I want to be saying in what I'm sharing today is that when we do fail, when we realize we're weak, when we suffer, we're actually, we might feel like we're excluded or rejected or falling short or any of that as a result, but it actually places us in the center of everything. Center of life, in the center of what makes us human with each other, in the center of connecting with God. So, now this might sound like a bit of a paradoxical thing to say, but I think I've often largely failed at failing, by which I do not mean that I haven't failed often. But I think I haven't been particularly good at accepting, relating to my own failure, even letting myself experience it, communicate it. A couple reasons. One is personality. Part of my personality style is to not really remember anything that goes wrong. So, everything that's happened up to my life up to this point has been awesome. I've never really made any mistakes. I've really never regretted anything. I've always been.
Is that your mother talking?
No, not at all. No, this is actually how I tend to remember life. It's just the way I'm wired. So I just don't have time for regret very much. I really realized this the most when I was in California. I was part of my counselor training, my graduate program. I was doing a practicum at a community counseling center with a Gestalt therapist who was a Gestalt therapist all through the 70s. So he did real pop psychology speak well, but in a beautifully authentic and rich way. And so I really love working with this guy. And he was interviewing me for the practicum placement. And so it wasn't counseling, wasn't therapy he was doing with me, but you could never tell. But so he's interviewing me, and he was just wanting to know something about my life. So I told him how I'd moved out to New Brunswick from Winnipeg, from central Canada, when I was in my mid-20s, recently married, 1-year-old daughter. And how we'd had this dream of starting a study center that would be a place where people would live together in community. We'd be kind of back to the landish, grow most of our own food, and people would come and stay for us for shorter or longer periods of time, and kind of an idealistic vision of what we would be doing. And we did this briefly 10 kilometers out of town, a little village called Moores Mills that you drive by when you go from here to Fredericton. And we packed up all our belongings. Everyone thought we were crazy, but we just did it anyway. Pete confirmed that when we landed here, and we told him our dream, and he said, "Oh, you guys are crazy," which is his way of saying he loved us, which was awesome. And so there was lots of craziness in it, in good and bad ways probably. But we had a good time playing with this for a few years, and then realized, as often happens with dreams like that wasn't actually all that practical. So, go figure. Having to work at, I think it was 16 or 18 jobs over that time, just desperately trying to keep some food on the table while trying to make the other thing work. And, we had to kind of wrap up that plan. And so I was telling him this, and I'd explained the dream, with a fair amount of passion with him, and then said, so it didn't work, so I came here to get a counseling degree. And he goes, okay, so this was a really big dream in your life. You prepared for it for years before you started, and then you sold everything you had, you packed everything up, and you moved across the country, thousands of miles to this other place. Yeah. You poured your whole heart into making this thing work, and and then it fell apart. Yeah. And then you didn't feel anything about that? Oh. Yeah, maybe. And it was a very weird feeling, because even though this would have been probably a year after the sort of wrapping up of that dream, I walked out of this job interview that was more like therapy, and I felt like I'd been sliced open. That was like all those feelings were, they were actually in there somewhere, and I just never paid any attention to them. So thanks to him, I had to. But for a day, and then I shut them back up, and that was good. But that is still my default style. My default style is still to put the best face on things and move on and move forward. And it's not bad, but it sometimes, as a counselor, it's not the thing that equips you the best to deal with others who are more openly dealing with their stuff, for example. So it definitely is something that I struggle with as a bit of a weakness. But another way that I've found is I've come to learn that I'm a bit quirky, that I see things in different ways than other people see things, and I grew up quite religious and idealistic, and I had a pretty stable and secure upbringing, so things that have affected other people I took for granted, and so the kind of things that I would think of as failures, I would sometimes try to share them with some vulnerability in some groups, and they'd often fall kind of flat, actually, because they were such different ways of thinking that people didn't really relate to it. And so I actually learned from some of those times of sharing. I remember one that was particularly poignant was with a kind of a men's group that met for a while. This is quite a ways back at church, and I just shared one way that I was struggling with something, and it just felt like for about 2 minutes there was the puzzled looks on people's faces, and then they went, okay, so next. Like, it was a really weird feeling. It was just this, like I'm from another planet or something kind of feeling. So when it doesn't come very naturally to me anyways to do that, and feel like I often kind of miss connecting with people when I do it, is sometimes made that hard. And and another piece is that I've also learned that sometimes when you're in leadership positions, there's a general atmosphere that people want leaders to be vulnerable, but they don't really want them to be too vulnerable in every kind of way. So sometimes there are definitely signals from people that, let us keep admiring you and keeping you on a pedestal, please, thanks. And so sometimes that doesn't always go all that well. So that probably sounds like some self-justification for not being as vulnerable as I would like to be all the time. But it is, I think, an honest account of why I do sometimes struggle with being as vulnerable about some of these things as I would like, because I do think that community is about that kind of vulnerability, and that I'd hate to present myself, and I'm sure a lot of us around here feel like that. We don't want to present ourselves in ways that we feel like where you have it all together, and when you don't, you're not living up to things. In fact, it was quite interesting. We just had a staff faculty meeting about just around a week ago, where we did a talking circle, and we were just sharing about how things have been going so far this term. And there was a lot of positive and challenge in what people were sharing. And someone, I think it was Jeremy, said, "Boy, wouldn't it be good if students were listening in on this so that they could know how human and we all are." Now you probably know, anyways, because we do live fairly close together. But I think it is good to be reminding that all the kinds of struggles that you all have, that we have had too, or at least in some form or another, we know what that's like. So when you fail, when you realize you're weak, when we realize that this is our common thing that keeps us all together, there's a way to meet each other, and that brings us into probably the most important place for us to. And that's pretty much what I wanted to share. So share with each other, and if I ever say something really quirky and you don't understand it at all, you say, "Well, that's really weird, but I get that. It must be hard for you," and give me a hug or something. Thank you, singers.
So when is that up on YouTube?